Studio One at NBC in Burbank, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, April 1975. The lights were hot, the band was warming up, and backstage. Nobody had any idea that in less than an hour, this broadcast would become one of the most talked-about nights in the show's history. Pam Grier was the first guest booked that night, 25 years old, already a genuine phenomenon in the film industry, star of Coffee, Foxy Brown, and a string of films that had made her one of the biggest box office draws in the country. She was smart, sharp-tongued, and fiercely proud of what she'd built, an image of strength and independence that had never existed on screen quite that way before, carved out in an industry that had rarely given black actresses leading roles, let alone roles where they held the gun and called the shots. She'd spent years fighting for that image, fighting studios that wanted to diminish her characters, fighting reporters who reduced her work to a single word, blaxploitation, as if that label captured everything she'd built with her own talent and determination. She'd earned every ounce of her success, and she carried herself like someone who knew exactly what that cost her. Backstage, her publicist ran through the interview outline one final time. "Johnny's going to ask about the new film, ask about your approach to these action roles, maybe touch on the industry a little. Should be straightforward." "Should be," Pam said, checking her reflection in the mirror. "With Johnny, you never entirely know. If you're already curious where this is heading, hit that subscribe button, because tonight's broadcast is about to take a turn nobody saw coming." The show began normally, Johnny's opening monologue, a few jokes about the Ford administration, something about inflation, the usual warm-up material. The audience laughed along comfortably, then Johnny introduced his first guest. "My first guest tonight is one of the biggest stars working in film right now. She's redefined what an action heroine looks like on the big screen. Please welcome the incredible Pam Grier." The opened. Pam walked out with total confidence, wearing a striking outfit that commanded the room the second she appeared. The audience rose to their feet, applauding enthusiastically. She waved, smiled, and took her seat beside Johnny's desk with the ease of someone who owned every room she entered. "Pam, thank you for being here," Johnny said once the applause settled. "Thanks for having me, Johnny. You've had quite a run these past couple years. Coffee, Foxy Brown, you've become one of the biggest names in action pictures, period. Not just for a woman, not just in that particular genre. Period. I appreciate you saying it that way, because a lot of people won't." "What do you mean?" Pam leaned back slightly. "There's this tendency in this business to put an asterisk next to what I do. She's great for a woman. She's tough for someone in these kinds of movies. I'm tired of the asterisk, Johnny. I built these characters. I fought for every one of them." The audience applauded her directness. Johnny nodded, genuinely engaged. "Tell me about that fight. What was it like breaking into an industry that wasn't exactly designed with you in mind?" Pam talked for several minutes about the uphill battle, about producers who wanted to soften her characters, about reporters who couldn't seem to write about her without mentioning her looks before her talent, about the constant grind of proving herself in an industry that kept trying to put her in a box. "I had to build something nobody had built before," Pam said. "A woman who's the hero, who holds the gun, who doesn't need saving. That wasn't a role that existed for someone who looked like me until I forced the issue." The interview was going beautifully. The audience was captivated. Johnny was clearly enjoying the conversation, nodding along, asking sharp follow-up questions. About 15 minutes in, Johnny glanced toward his cue cards with a slight smile. "Pam, I've got a surprise for you tonight. We've got another guest joining us, and given everything we've been discussing, the action genre, the gun-toting heroes of the moment, I thought it might make for an interesting pairing." Pam's expression shifted, curiosity mixed with something more guarded. "Who's that?" "Clint Eastwood." The audience gasped audibly, already sensing the electricity of what was coming. Pam's face went carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that takes real effort to maintain. "Clint Eastwood's here tonight? He's our surprise guest. I thought it'd be fascinating to have the two of you on together. Two of the biggest names in action cinema right now, from very different corners of the industry." "Interesting," Pam said, her tone giving away almost nothing. Nobody in that studio knew it yet, but this was about to become one of the most tense moments in the show's history. Backstage, Clint Eastwood sat in the green room watching the interview on the monitor. He'd been booked as a surprise guest specifically because the producers thought the pairing would make great television. Two icons of the action genre sitting down together comparing notes on a kind of stardom that few people in Hollywood actually understood from the inside. A production assistant knocked on his door. "Mr. Eastwood, you're on in about 5 minutes." "Thanks." Clint had watched some of Pam's interview already, and he respected what he'd heard. He knew her work, had seen Coffee, thought Foxy Brown was sharper and more interesting than critics gave it credit for. He was looking forward to the conversation, genuinely curious what she'd have to say about the industry from her particular vantage point. He had no idea what was about to happen. Out on stage, Johnny turned back to Pam. "So, you two haven't met before?" "No," Pam said, "never had the pleasure." Something in the way she said pleasure carried an edge that the audience picked up on immediately, even if they couldn't quite place why. "Well, let's bring him out," Johnny said, sensing the tension but choosing to plow forward, trusting his instincts that this would make for compelling television regardless of which direction it went. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Clint Eastwood." The band struck up, the curtain opened. Clint walked out with his usual easy stride, gave a small wave to the crowd, who erupted into applause nearly as loud as they'd given Pam. He walked to the desk, shook Johnny's hand, and turned to extend his hand toward Pam. She looked at his outstretched hand, she looked at his face, and she did not take it. The studio went completely silent. "If you think you know where this story is going, trust me, you don't. Stick around." For a long, excruciating moment, Clint's hand simply hung in the air between them, unshaken. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure what they were witnessing, unsure if this was some kind of bit or something entirely genuine and unplanned. Clint slowly lowered his hand, his expression unreadable, and took his seat beside Johnny without comment. Johnny, veteran of thousands of broadcasts, was momentarily at a total loss for words. He glanced between his two guests, trying to gauge whether to address what had just happened or attempt to move past it. "Well," Johnny finally said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This is certainly an interesting pairing tonight." "Interesting's one word for it," Pam said flatly. "Pam, is everything all right?" She turned to face Johnny directly, ignoring Clint entirely. "Johnny, I appreciate you wanting to bring two action stars together. I really do. But I think you should have asked me first before springing this on live television. I'm sorry. I didn't realize there was an issue. I thought this would be a fun conversation between two people at the top of the same genre." "The same genre?" Pam repeated, something sharp entering her voice now. "Is that really how you see it, the same genre?" The audience was leaning forward now, sensing they were witnessing something real, something unscripted, something that had genuinely caught even the show's veteran host off guard. Clint sat quietly, watching Pam carefully, giving no indication of frustration or offense, simply observing. "Help me understand," Johnny said carefully. "What's the issue here?" Pam took a breath, clearly deciding whether to hold back or let it out fully in front of 70 million people. She chose the latter. Mr. Eastwood makes films where a white gunslinger walks into a town, shoots whoever needs shooting, and rides off into the sunset as a hero. Critics call it art. They call it mythology. They give it Oscar nominations. Her voice was rising now, controlled but unmistakably passionate. "I make films where a black woman picks up a gun to protect her community, to fight back against the exact same kind of violence and exploitation that's been done to people who look like me for centuries. And what do they call my films? Exploitation, trash, a cheap genre that should be ashamed of itself." The studio was dead silent. Every eye fixed on the unfolding confrontation. "That's not a fair comparison in my opinion," Pam continued. "That's not the same genre at all. That's two completely different standards being applied to two people doing fundamentally similar work, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise just to make good television." Johnny shifted in his seat, clearly unprepared for the direction this had taken. "Pam, I don't think anyone intended. I know nobody intended anything, Johnny. That's exactly the problem. Nobody has to intend it. It just happens anyway." She still hadn't looked at Clint directly, addressing everything to Johnny as if Clint weren't sitting 3 feet away from her. Before we go further into this incredible confrontation, make sure you've hit that subscribe button, because what Clint says next changes absolutely everything. The tension in that studio had become almost unbearable. Crew members exchanged nervous glances. The floor director was frantically signaling toward the control booth, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the moment play out. In the booth, the producer made a split-second decision that would define the rest of the broadcast. They let the cameras keep rolling. Finally, Clint spoke. His voice was calm, measured, carrying none of the defensiveness the moment might have called for. "You're right. Pam turned to look at him for the first time since he'd sat down, clearly not expecting those two words. Excuse me? I said you're right about the double standard. It's real, and it's something I've thought about myself more than people probably realize. The audience murmured, surprised by the response. I'm not going to sit here and pretend the film industry treats my work and your work the same way, Clint continued. It doesn't. My films get called mythology. Yours get called exploitation. That's not because the work is fundamentally different in quality or in what it's trying to say. It's because of who's making it and who it's about and who's sitting in the critics' seats deciding what gets to be called art. Pam studied him carefully, clearly trying to determine if this was genuine or some kind of practiced deflection. That's a nice thing to say on television, she said, still guarded. Doesn't change the reality of how things actually work behind the scenes. No, it doesn't, Clint agreed. Saying it here doesn't fix anything by itself. But I'd rather say it honestly than pretend the comparison Johnny set up tonight was some kind of fair, equal pairing. It wasn't, and I think Johnny probably didn't think that through before he did it. Johnny raised his hand slightly. I'll own that. I genuinely didn't consider it from that angle. I saw two of the biggest names in action films and thought it'd make for great television. I didn't think about everything underneath that. That's exactly the problem, Pam said, though her tone had softened slightly now that Clint wasn't fighting her on the substance of what she'd said. Nobody thinks about it until somebody's forced to say it out loud. Clint leaned forward slightly. Can I ask you something? Pam hesitated, then nodded. You didn't shake my hand when I walked out, and I understand why now, hearing what you just said. But I want to ask you directly, is your issue actually with me, or is it with what I represent to you, sitting here as an easy symbol of everything you've had to fight against? The studio held its breath. Pam was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her answer carefully. Honestly, I don't know you personally, Mr. Eastwood. I've never met you before tonight. My issue isn't with you as a person. It's with an industry that puts you on a pedestal and puts me in a box, and then has the nerve to act surprised when I don't want to smile through it for the cameras. That's fair, Clint said. More than fair, but, Pam continued, you're also not exactly separate from that industry. You benefit from it every single day, whether you intend to or not. Every time your films get called serious cinema and mine get called trash, you're the one collecting the Oscar nominations. I'm not saying that's your fault personally. I'm saying it's worth acknowledging instead of pretending we're just two peers in the same genre having a friendly chat. If this conversation is gripping you the way it gripped that studio audience, hit that like button right now. Clint nodded slowly, absorbing what she'd said without any visible defensiveness. You're right that I benefit from it. I won't pretend otherwise. And I think the honest thing to do right now isn't to argue with you about whether the double standard exists. It obviously does. The more useful thing would be to talk about what it would actually take to change it. Talk's cheap, Pam said, though something in her posture had shifted slightly, less rigid than before. It is, Clint agreed. So, let me ask you a real question instead of talking in circles. What films of yours have critics actually engaged with seriously? Not the ones that got dismissed as exploitation, the ones where they actually looked at the craft. Pam thought about it. Almost none, if I'm honest. Even when the reviews were positive, they were positive in this backhanded way. Surprisingly good for this kind of film, like the bar was on the floor to begin with. That's exactly the problem, Clint said. I've had critics analyze my films frame by frame, discussing composition and pacing and what the silence means in a given scene. Your films get the same level of craft, the same intentionality, and instead of analysis, they get a dismissive label slapped on them before anyone bothers looking closely. You've actually thought about this, Pam said, sounding genuinely surprised. I have. Not because I'm some kind of saint fighting for justice. I'm not going to pretend that. But because I've spent time on sets, I've directed my own work, and I understand what it actually takes to build a character audiences believe in, to construct a scene that lands the way it's supposed to. I can see the craft in your films because I understand what craft looks like from the inside. Most critics reviewing your work have never picked up a camera in their lives. They're reacting to surface-level assumptions about what kind of story deserves respect. Pam sat back slightly, clearly reconsidering her initial read on this conversation. So, what do we do about it? She asked, some of the hostility fading from her voice, replaced by something more like genuine curiosity. I don't have a perfect answer, Clint admitted, but I know one thing that might actually matter. When people like me, people who already have that credibility, whether we fully earned it or been handed it by an unfair system, when we stay quiet about work like yours instead of actively pointing at it and saying, "This is serious craft. Pay attention. We're part of the problem." Silence is its own kind of endorsement of the status quo. And if you speak up, what difference does that actually make? Maybe none, Clint said honestly. Maybe it's just words, like you said. But maybe it opens one door that wasn't open before. Maybe some studio executive who respects my opinion for whatever reason actually listens when I say, "Your work deserves better treatment than it's gotten." I can't promise it fixes the whole system. I can promise I won't stay quiet about it anymore now that we've had this conversation. The studio remained completely silent, riveted by a conversation that had transformed from confrontation into something far more substantive and unexpected. Johnny, sensing the shift in the room, spoke carefully. "This has become a far more serious conversation than I think anyone expected walking in here tonight." "Maybe it needed to happen," Pam said, looking at Johnny now instead of Clint. "Maybe the fact that it happened on live television in front of millions of people instead of in some private green room where nobody hears it. Maybe that actually matters." "I agree," Clint said quietly. There was a long pause. The tension in the room hadn't fully dissolved, but something had genuinely shifted. Pam turned back to face Clint directly for the first time since the confrontation began. "Can I be honest about something else?" she asked. "Please." "When I refused to shake your hand, part of me wanted you to get defensive. Wanted you to make excuses or get offended or turn it into a fight about your own reputation instead of actually hearing what I was saying. I've had that happen before with other people in this industry. They hear criticism and immediately make it about protecting themselves. I understand why. You'd expect that. You didn't do that. You actually listened. That's rarer than you probably realize." Clint was quiet for a moment. "I think if I'd gotten defensive, it would have proven exactly the point you were making, that the industry protects people like me instinctively even when we're wrong, even when we should be listening instead of talking. I didn't want to be one more example of that." Pam studied him for a long moment, something in her expression softening considerably. "I think I owe you an apology," she said finally. "Not for what I said about the industry. I stand by every word of that. But for how I handled the moment itself. Not shaking your hand, making it personal against you specifically when my actual issue is so much bigger than any one person." "You don't owe me anything," Clint said. "You called out something true in a way that made everyone in this room actually pay attention instead of letting it slide by comfortably. That took more courage than most people in this industry ever show. Before we get to how this moment ended, make sure you've subscribed because what happens next is the part nobody expected." Johnny, sensing an opportunity to steer the conversation towards something constructive, leaned forward. "Where do we go from here? Because I think this audience and everyone watching at home just witnessed something genuinely important happen on this stage tonight." Pam thought about it. "I think the industry needs to stop treating my genre and Clint's genre as fundamentally different things deserving different levels of respect. Both of us are telling stories about people pushed to their limits, forced to use violence because the systems around them failed to protect them. That's the same story told from different perspectives with different histories behind it." "I'd add something to that," Clint said. "I think people with platforms, people like me, who've already been given credibility this industry hands out unevenly, we need to actively use that platform to point toward work that deserves more attention instead of just accepting the compliments and moving on with our day." "Are you saying that just to say it?" Pam asked directly. "Or are you actually going to do something?" Clint met her gaze steadily. "I'm saying it because I mean it. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, practically speaking. But I'm not going to sit in interviews from now on and let critics compare us like we're in completely separate categories without pushing back on that comparison myself." "That's a real commitment," Johnny said. "On live television, no less." "It is," Clint said, "and I intend to keep it." Pam looked at him for a long moment, then extended her hand. "I think I owe you this now," she said, "properly this time." Clint took her hand and shook it, firm and genuine, the gesture landing entirely differently than it would have at the start of the segment. The studio audience erupted into applause, not the polite, uncertain applause of confusion, but something louder, more genuine, recognizing they'd just witnessed something real happen in front of them, something that had started as confrontation and ended somewhere far more meaningful. Johnny let out a breath. "Well, I don't think I've ever had a broadcast quite like this one. Ladies and gentlemen, Pam Grier and Clint Eastwood. During the commercial break, the studio buzzed with activity. Producers rushed around, uncertain how to handle the fallout of what had just aired live, uncertain whether this had been a disaster or the best television the show had produced in years. Backstage, Pam and Clint sat together in the green room, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly settling. "That was not how I expected tonight to go," Pam admitted, accepting a glass of water from an assistant. "Neither did I," Clint said, "but I'm glad it happened this way instead of some polite, meaningless conversation that skated past everything that actually matters. Most people wouldn't have handled that the way you did. Most people would have gotten defensive, made it about their own reputation. I've had people challenge me before. Usually it's easier to just get defensive, protect the ego, but you weren't wrong about anything you said. Getting defensive would have just proven your point for you." Pam smiled slightly, the first genuine smile since the confrontation had begun. "You know, before tonight, I honestly assumed you'd be exactly the kind of person I was frustrated with, the kind who benefits from the system and never bothers to notice it, let alone question it." "I probably was that person for a lot of years," Clint admitted. "I think tonight forced me to actually sit with something I'd noticed before, but never said out loud. It's a lot easier to notice unfairness than it is to actually name it, especially when naming it means admitting you've benefited from it. That's honest. I try to be, especially when it actually costs me something to say it." They sat together for a while longer, the conversation shifting toward their respective careers, the industry more broadly, the specific challenges each of them had faced coming up through very different paths in the same demanding business. "Can I ask you something?" Pam said eventually. "Go ahead. Are you actually going to follow through on what you said, about using your platform differently?" Clint considered the question seriously. "I intend to. I can't promise you exactly what that looks like yet. But I don't say things on live television lately, especially not things that could come back to embarrass me if I don't follow through. I'll be watching," Pam said, though her tone carried more warmth now than warning. "I'd expect nothing less." The broadcast aired that same night, and the reaction was immediate and enormous. Newspapers ran headlines the next morning analyzing the confrontation, some framing it as a disaster for the show, others recognizing it as one of the most genuinely important conversations ever to happen on a late-night program. The Los Angeles Times ran a piece titled "The Handshake That Wasn't." Pam Grier confronts Hollywood's double standard on live television. The article dissected the entire exchange, praising both Pam's courage in speaking honestly about an uncomfortable truth and Clint's willingness to actually listen instead of defending himself reflexively. Film critics who had spent years dismissing Pam's work as mere exploitation found themselves forced to reckon publicly with the accusation that their own biases had shaped those judgments. Several prominent critics wrote follow-up pieces, some defensive, some genuinely reflective, reconsidering how they'd approached films led by black actresses compared to films led by white male leads doing fundamentally similar work. Within the industry itself, the conversation sparked something larger. Producers who had previously dismissed certain genres and certain performers based on unconscious bias found themselves fielding uncomfortable questions from journalists about their own practices. If this story is teaching you something powerful about honesty and accountability, please subscribe button and turn on notifications. 2 weeks after the broadcast, Clint made good on his promise in a way nobody had entirely anticipated. He gave an extensive interview to a major film magazine specifically about the confrontation with Pam Grier, using the platform not to discuss his own career, but to actively advocate for a reevaluation of how the industry treated films led by black performers. "I've spent my career benefiting from a system that calls my work art and calls comparable work by other performers exploitation," Clint told the interviewer. "That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern, and it's one I'm done pretending I don't see." He specifically praised Pam's craft in detail, breaking down scenes from her films with the same analytical seriousness critics usually reserved for his own work, demonstrating exactly the kind of engagement he'd promised on air. Pam saw the interview when it published and called him directly. "I saw the piece," she said when he picked up, "and you actually did it. I half expected you to forget about it once the cameras stopped rolling. I told you I meant it. Most people say that and don't follow through. I'm not most people," Clint said simply. "At least, I try not to be when it actually matters." There was a pause on the line. "Thank you," Pam said finally, her voice more sincere than it had been at any point during their confrontation. for actually listening that night, and for following through afterward. Thank you for saying what needed to be said, even though it would have been a lot easier for you to just shake my hand and move through a polite, meaningless interview. I've never been particularly good at polite and meaningless. That's exactly why the conversation mattered. Over the following years, their paths crossed occasionally at industry events, film premieres, award ceremonies. Each time, there was a mutual recognition between them. Not quite friendship in the traditional sense, but something built on that single, tense, ultimately transformative conversation. In 1978, when Clint was asked to serve on a committee evaluating film preservation efforts, he specifically advocated for including several of Pam's films alongside more traditionally respected pictures, arguing that cinema history couldn't honestly be told while dismissing an entire genre and the performers who built it. These films matter, Clint told the committee, not despite what they represent, but because of it. They tell a story about American cinema that the more celebrated pictures often ignore entirely. The committee initially resisted, but Clint's persistence, along with growing critical reevaluation of Pam's work throughout the industry, eventually led to several of her films being included in a major retrospective the following year. Pam attended the retrospective screening, and afterward, she found Clint in the lobby. "I heard you fought for this," she said. "I fought for the truth. Your films earned their place. I just made sure people actually had to look at them seriously instead of dismissing them out of hand. You didn't have to do that. I said I would. I meant it." Pam smiled, genuine warmth in her expression now, years removed from that tense confrontation on Johnny Carson's stage. "You know, that handshake I refused back in '75, I think about that night sometimes, about how it could have gone so differently if you'd reacted the way most people in your position would have." "I think about it too," Clint admitted. "It taught me something I needed to learn in a way that was uncomfortable enough to actually stick." "What's that?" "That being genuinely good at something isn't the same as deserving credit for it fairly. Sometimes the credit gets distributed based on things that have nothing to do with the actual work. I'd benefited from that imbalance for years without fully reckoning with it. You forced that reckoning in front of millions of people, and I'm grateful for it, even though it was uncomfortable in the moment." In 1985, a decade after that famous confrontation, a young journalist working on a retrospective piece about pivotal moments in television history reached out to both Pam and Clint separately, hoping to get their individual reflections on what had happened that night. Pam's response was thoughtful and direct. That night wasn't really about Clint Eastwood personally. It was about an entire system that decided some stories deserved to be called mythology and others deserved to be called trash, based on nothing more substantial than who was telling the story and who it was about. What made that night matter wasn't the tension itself. Plenty of tense moments happen on live television and get forgotten within a week. What made it matter was what came after. Clint didn't just apologize and move on. He actually did something with it. Clint's response echoed similar themes. "I think about that night more than almost any other professional moment in my career. Not because it was comfortable. It wasn't. Because it forced me to actually confront something I'd been benefiting from without examining closely." Pam Grier didn't owe me politeness that night. She owed the truth to everyone watching, and she delivered it fearlessly. The least I could do was listen, and then actually act on what I'd heard. The piece, when it published, became something of a touchstone for discussions about accountability in the entertainment industry, cited repeatedly in the years that followed whenever conversations arose about representation, bias, and the uneven ways critical respect got distributed across different genres and different performers. If you're finding this story genuinely inspiring, please like this video before we continue. By the 1990s, the industry landscape had shifted considerably, in part due to conversations that had been sparked, however uncomfortably, by moments like that Tonight Show confrontation. Pam's work began receiving the kind of serious critical reevaluation that had eluded her for years, with film scholars finally engaging with the craft and social commentary embedded in her most celebrated performances. Clint, meanwhile, had become one of the most respected directors in Hollywood, using his considerable influence to advocate for diverse voices and stories that might otherwise have struggled to find backing within a still imperfect industry. In 1993, when Clint won his first Academy Award for directing Unforgiven, he used part of his acceptance speech to reflect on the broader responsibility that came with recognition in an industry that didn't distribute credit evenly. Recognition like this comes with an obligation, Clint said from the podium, 70 million viewers watching once again. Though this time the moment carried entirely different weight than that tense confrontation nearly 2 decades earlier. An obligation to actually look at who else deserves this same recognition and hasn't received it. I learned that lesson the hard way a long time ago from someone who had the courage to tell me an uncomfortable truth on live television. I'm still trying to live up to what she taught me that night. Pam, watching the broadcast from home, felt something settle in her chest at those words. Not vindication exactly, but a genuine sense that the confrontation all those years ago had mattered. Had actually changed something real in how at least one powerful person in this industry approached his own responsibility. She sent him a short note the following week. Saw the speech. Still keeping your word after all these years. That matters more than you probably know. Clint kept that note for the rest of his career tucked alongside other letters and mementos that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to use influence responsibly. Years later, in an interview reflecting on his long career, Clint was asked directly about the moments that had most profoundly shaped his approach to filmmaking and to his responsibilities within the industry. People expect me to talk about directors I studied under or actors I learned from on set, Clint said. And those things mattered, certainly. But one of the most important lessons of my entire career came from a woman who refused to shake my hand on live television in 1975. Pam Grier, the interviewer, confirmed. That's right. She called out something true that night. Something I'd been comfortably ignoring for years without even realizing I was doing it. And instead of getting defensive, instead of protecting my own ego, I had the chance to actually listen. That choice, to listen instead of defend, shaped how I've approached this entire industry ever since. Do you think that moment changed the industry itself, or just you personally? Clint considered the question carefully. I think it changed me first, and I think changing individuals, one honest conversation at a time, is often how larger change actually happens. It's rarely one dramatic moment that fixes everything. It's a series of uncomfortable truths said clearly to people willing to actually hear them. Pam gave me that gift that night, even though it didn't feel like a gift in the moment. It felt like a confrontation, but confrontation, when it's honest, can be its own kind of generosity. Pam Grier continued working steadily throughout her career, eventually earning the kind of serious critical respect that had eluded her in those earlier years. Her contributions to American cinema finally receiving the recognition they'd always deserved. When she reflected on her career in later interviews, that Tonight Show confrontation remained a significant touchstone. I get asked about that night constantly, Pam said in a 2005 interview. People want to know if I regret how confrontational I was, whether I wish I'd handled it more diplomatically. And the honest answer is no. I don't regret a single word. Because that confrontation, uncomfortable as it was for everyone in that studio, actually led somewhere. It led to real conversation, real accountability, real change, however incremental. If I'd stayed polite and quiet, none of that happens. What made Clint's response different from what you expected? He listened without making it about defending himself. That's rarer than people realize, especially from someone with as much to protect as he had at that point in his career. He could have easily dismissed what I said, made a joke, moved the conversation along the way. Most people in his position would have. Instead, he actually heard me, and more importantly, he acted on what he heard for years afterward, not just in that single moment on stage. The footage from that April night in 1975 still circulates today, resurfacing periodically as discussions about representation and accountability in entertainment continue to evolve. New generations discover the clip and are often stunned by how directly the confrontation unfolded on live television, how raw and unscripted it clearly was, and how remarkably it transformed from tension into something genuinely constructive. Film historians and cultural critics continue to cite that broadcast as a pivotal, if underappreciated, moment in television history. Not because of dramatic spectacle, but because of what it demonstrated about the possibility of genuine accountability happening in real time, in front of an enormous audience, between two people who had every reason to simply talk past each other instead of actually listening. Pam Grier refused to shake Clint Eastwood's hand that night, expecting perhaps a defensive reaction, expecting the kind of dismissal she'd encountered so many times before from people unwilling to examine their own advantages within an unfair system. What she got instead was something far more valuable, genuine acknowledgement followed by years of actual follow-through. Proof that an uncomfortable truth, spoken clearly and without apology, can actually change how someone moves through the world and through an industry that desperately needed that kind of honest reckoning. That's what left the studio frozen that night. Not the initial tension, not the refused handshake itself, but the moment everyone in that room realized they were witnessing something genuinely rare. Two people willing to have an honest conversation about fairness and representation, live, unscripted, in front of the entire country, with no guarantee it would end anywhere good. It ended somewhere better than anyone could have predicted walking into that studio that evening. Not because the industry's problems were solved in a single conversation. They weren't. But because one honest exchange proved that accountability was possible, that listening was possible, that genuine change could begin with something as simple and as difficult as refusing to shake a hand until the truth had actually been spoken.